Welcome to the Sonoma Valley Historical Society's lecture on Solomon Schocken, Sonoma's preeminent Jewish entrepreneur by Peter Meyerhoff. We welcome you here today to this series of second Saturday lectures that the Historical Society gives every year. We want to thank you for attending and also pitch that the Sonoma Valley Historical Society is able to provide these lectures through donations and membership to our organization. You'll see the address at the end of this lecture. And with that, Peter Meyerhoff, thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Well, let me start by explaining how this talk came about. Several months ago, the Sonoma Valley Historical Society received a very generous donation from Michael Shansky, a former resident of Sonoma. It consisted of many cartons of his unpublished research notes that he conducted 40 years ago. Much of this dealt with Solomon Schocken. And after distilling boxes of material and combining it with photos and other information, mostly from the Historical Society, a fascinating story arose. Schocken was revealed as the most successful and influential Sonoman who linked the eras of General Vallejo and of Samuel Sebastiani 100 years later. Now, Solomon Schocken was born into a large family on Christmas Day in 1842 in the small town of Rogasen in the German province of Posen, which is today part of Poland. Being of the Jewish faith, his family was subject to the prejudice and economic hardships of the day. But unlike many other areas, the Jews of Posen were given German citizenship. Jews were involved primarily in the service sector and in commerce. Young Solomon stayed in Posen and acquired the skills of a baker. He was later described as 5'3", with a fair complexion, blue eyes, and red hair. In 1862, he immigrated to New York because he was ambitious. There were already almost 150,000 Jews in America, 2/3 of whom were recent immigrants from Germany. In fact, German subjects, Jewish or not, were generally held in high regard as immigrants in the 19th century. When Schocken arrived in the country, it was in the middle of the Civil War, and over 200,000 native-born Germans fought for the Union. But Schocken had other ideas. His trade as baker was much in demand to prepare the huge supplies of hardtack needed for army rations. Schocken aspired to much more than being a baker in New York, so he purchased passage on a ship headed to San Francisco, where he arrived in the spring of 1863. He bartered for goods that could successfully be sold to the miners in the Sierras. And after a brief visit to Oregon and 2 years in Hawaii, where he opened a restaurant, he sold out and returned to California in 1867 for good. He settled in the town of Monticello, which is today under the waters of Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Here he became a successful clerk and merchant in the store of another immigrant from the Posen area. In 1871, at the age of 28, he became a citizen of the United States. And the following year, he married Dora Baer in Napa. Dora was his sister's sister-in-law. Now, 2 years later, Solomon and Dora rode into Sonoma. Unlike Napa and San Francisco, Sonoma had no Jewish community. His move appears to have been entirely for commercial reasons. In the fall of 1873, he opened a small store on the plaza. This was the building owned by C.F. Lighting, another native of Germany, which is today the Toscana Hotel. The store had been known as Lighting's store, and Schocken probably purchased the entire stock of Lighting so he could begin business at once. Now, a shopping experience was very different in Schocken's day from today. Almost everything was behind the counter. The clerk found what you requested. You established an account which could be paid in cash or barter. Schocken's ledger book shows he accepted at various times trade in chickens, boxes of peaches, ads in the local paper from the local editor, or work such as painting and hauling. What made Schocken very successful as a merchant was his business model. He could benefit from low profit margins because of high sales and low profits. His fast turnover of product allowed him to replenish supplies with fresh or different goods. He was rarely undersold by other Sonoma merchants, and he did well by buying and selling the products people wanted, including items no other local merchant offered. Customers reported his store was always clean and orderly. It was rare that his competitors attempted to retaliate in the face of Schocken's success, but one incident was recorded. Very soon after Schocken first arrived in Sonoma, a visitor sarcastically wrote, "A little Jew called Schocken opened a store in that town." Being a sharp businessman, he soon obtained the greater part of the trade of Sonoma, greatly to the discomfort of the other merchants, who with an envious eye watched the growing popularity of the diminutive Jew and his coquettish wife. On several occasions, they tried to undersell him, but to no purpose. Schocken always held his ground. Finding at last they could not compete with him in a business way, they unearthed the law which requires stores to be kept closed on Sunday. Some person of mean disposition swore out a complaint, and Mr. Schocken was arrested and brought before the justice of the peace, who fined the delinquent the sum of $10. On the following Monday, Schocken was again arrested for having sold goods on Sunday. He pleaded as an excuse that he kept the Sabbath by observing the Saturday as prescribed by his religion. Those words had hardly been uttered when the justice of the peace howled, "Mr. Clerk, please collect $25. And if he ever be brought before me on a charge of this kind, he shall be sent to prison." Now, the records show that Schocken never was imprisoned, but perhaps more importantly, that the other merchants of Sonoma came to accept Schocken as a worthy competitor they would have to reckon with. Now, the following year, Schocken bought the parcel of land between the Sonoma Barracks and the Sonoma Mission. In other words, the First Street East right of way. He paid $400 and opened Sonoma's first lumber yard on this property. This purchase of land and another 2 years later behind the Mission were the first of many in this area that would consolidate his holdings around the northeast corner of the plaza, soon known as Schocken's Corner. But it was in June of 1878 that Schocken made one of his most important acquisitions. He purchased the entire Sonoma Barracks and the lot north of it for $2,500 in gold coin from General Vallejo. Vallejo had been using the barracks as a wine cellar. In order to afford the purchase and extensive remodeling, Schocken took out a loan from the new Sonoma Valley Bank. Reconstruction of the barracks lasted until early 1879. And he made major changes to the Sonoma Barracks. The eastern half of the building was converted into a general store with a wooden floor and large windows. The ceiling was raised from 9 to 18 feet, still allowing a separate suite under the eaves. The outside was given a wooden Victorian gingerbread facade. A covered portico was erected with wide front doors set in the middle. The suite directly over the store was given a window in the east wall for light and rented out to a series of tenants. Now, the western half of the building had 2 storerooms downstairs accessible from the front. The upstairs and back of this part of the building would become the residence of Solomon and Dora. A large cupola was built in front, while long balconies were reconstructed on the front and back sides. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms, a parlor, and a sitting room, all carpeted and well furnished. Later, Schocken bought elaborate furniture, including a grand piano and large paintings. There was also a bathroom with hot and cold water. Downstairs, behind the storage rooms, was his pantry, kitchen, and dining room that faced a large garden in the back. His horse and buggy were kept in a nearby stable, and a granary was built on the lot behind the building. Schocken would later boast that his residence was as well fixed up as any house in the world. Now, Schocken's new store opened in April 1879 with a party for the locals. The opening was just in time for the first arrival of the Sonoma Valley Railway. It would bring passengers down Spain Street to the nearby depot in the northern part of the plaza. Schocken's conspicuous new building attracted many customers who stepped off the train. Henry Weil, another German immigrant, also recognized the value of Schocken's location and opened a store in the building which is today the Sonoma Hotel at the northwest corner of the plaza in December of 1879. There already were two other German immigrants, Julius Poppe and Frederick Düring, who owned stores on the east side of the plaza by this time. Now, after his initial faux pas in failing to recognize the locally accepted Sabbath, Schocken made successful efforts to assimilate into the community. In January 1880, he was initiated into the local Masonic Lodge. It was profitable to be able to associate with other influential members of the business community through the lodge, which acted as a chamber of commerce at the time. Now, Schocken's economic success in his early years is especially remarkable in view of the severe National Depression that started the year he arrived in Sonoma and continued on for 6 years. In addition, there had been a surge in Chinese immigrants to California in the late 1860s. The Chinese were willing to work for lower wages, which led to anti-Chinese sentiment in Sonoma and elsewhere. When the economy improved again in 1879, toleration of the Chinese improved again, at least in Sonoma. Now, by 1880, Schocken was taking a trip to San Francisco every week or two in order to buy a new stock of dry goods and arrange the sale of lumber and wine. He hired a clerk to supervise the store when he was away. The new Sonoma Valley Railroad, with a landing at Norfolk, which is today Wingo Station, and another at Sonoma Landing near the mouth of the Petaluma Creek, allowed a return trip to San Francisco in just one day. And soon Sunday excursion trains from San Francisco began to arrive in Sonoma during the summer months. Schocken's ornate building acted as a magnet for the tourists. That same year, 1880, he reached an agreement to lease his store to Frederick Kluwe, yet another German immigrant, with an option to buy it. Schocken agreed not to compete with Kluwe, who bought out the stock and fixtures of Schocken. And Schocken now used this opportunity to concentrate on other activities, such as his lumber yard and selling other commodities that he had. He built Sonoma's first bowling alley in 1880, just in front of the lumber yard. It had a single lane for 10-pin bowling. He agreed with the priest next door in the mission building not to operate it while there was any religious service at or in the neighboring church. He proposed a committee to prepare a plan to improve the appearance of the plaza, which had suffered with the railway construction. He served as the treasurer and knew that improvements would drive more tourists to the commercial establishments around the plaza. In late 1880, Schocken began talks with Archbishop Joseph Alemany concerning the purchase of the historic mission. Trains had been running down Spain Street directly in front of the church for over a year. Although it was a boon to merchants, the noise, the shaking, and the smoke were disagreeable to the parishioners. In addition, the surrounding stores and saloons were now legally open on Sundays, and the atmosphere was not conducive to prayer. So on July the 11th, 1881, the mission chapel, the priest's quarters, and the land to the rear were deeded to Schocken for $3,000. Archbishop Alemany was very happy because he had the funds now to build a new church in a quiet neighborhood on West Napa Street, which remains to this day the site of the Catholic Church. But General Vallejo was very unhappy. He now claimed that the land was actually his all along, and moreover, he had helped the church in the past, and now, in an almost impoverished condition, he could really use the money. His anger was entirely directed at Alemany and the Catholic Church. The relationship between Vallejo and Schocken had always been very cordial and remained so. In 1880, the Sonoma Index editor noted that Schocken and Vallejo had a friendly game of billiards, in which Schocken was shockingly beaten, he said. Vallejo had been a customer at Schocken's store since at least 1878. Here we see he had been extended credit for the purchase of wood, a shirt, sugar, butter, and other goods over 3 years without any payment. And after these 3 years, Schocken was willing to give him $100 in credit, as appears on the back of the statement. This money was provided at a time in Vallejo's life when he was extremely cash-strapped. He had received another loan for $100 from his son Platon, but had been turned down for loans from his sister, Encarnacion Cooper, his son-in-law, Dr. Levi Frisbee, and his attorney, Thomas Madden. And he was mortified by his financial situation and angered by those he believed should have come to his assistance. And there was probably much more financial assistance from Schocken than just this $100. A family member later stated Vallejo would have gone hungry without him. But now in 1881, Schocken wished to put the mission property to use for commercial purposes. He was aware that Vallejo's mother-in-law, Maria Carrillo, and one of her sons, Juan Carrillo, were buried there. He offered the Vallejos a grace period of 3 months to exhume the bodies and reinter them elsewhere. Benicia Vallejo appealed to her husband that she desperately wanted her mother's body reinterred in the family cemetery at La Crema Montes, and she requested her sister, Josefa Fitch, to assist financially. It is not known for certain if her mother's body was moved, but given the strong desire, the opportunity, and the lack of further mention of this subject, it seems that the body of Maria Carrillo was most likely removed in spite of popular opinion today. Once Schocken had possession of the mission chapel, he removed the ceiling gas lighting for safety reasons and used the space to store bales of hay and casks of wine. As for the adjacent former priest quarters, he leased it out to local winemaker Daniel Davison. This pioneer of Sonoma operated the old Sonoma winery out of this location. He owned several vineyards throughout the valley and used the former priest quarters as his wine cellar. He also fabricated wine barrels and stored barrels of grape mash in the adjacent sheds. At various times, cows and chickens were kept in the walled-off quadrangle in the rear. A picket fence was erected in front of the priest quarters. This photo taken in 1909 gives us an impression of what the interior may have looked like in the late 19th century. Now, throughout the 1880s, Schocken financed the immigration of many family members from Europe. He taught them the mercantile business while they lived with him and assisted in his store. One nephew, Elias Pash, probably with Schocken's assistance, even opened a general merchandise store in Sonoma in early 1883. His ads appeared only briefly in the Sonoma Index. Cluey was advertising his own store in these same issues and might have considered that Schocken was trying to get around his promise not to compete. So Cluey decided not to renew his lease and bought land to erect his own store in the southwest corner of the plaza, where he did very well for many years. Now, Sonoma had decided to reincorporate as a city in 1883. Schocken decided to run for one of the 5 city trustee positions. He tied for 5th place with Frank Corbally, the owner of the livery stable next to the Union Hotel. As the special runoff election between these candidates approached, the Sonoma Index editor Frank Merritt published several short articles of invective against Schocken. He called him pinch penny Schocken, whose prices were not as low as indicated. When Schocken won the runoff election by a large margin, the editor implied without evidence that Schocken had bought the election and swore he would never surrender the independence of the paper, no matter how wealthy Schocken was. Schocken, in turn, did not advertise in Merritt's Sonoma Index again. He did place a few ads in the competing newspapers, the Sonoma Tribune and the Sonoma Valley Expositor. As soon as Merritt retired from the Index, Schocken resumed his ads. And with Cluey out of the store, Schocken announced that he had re-engaged the old stand, which has been entirely remodeled. Now, the city trustees, of which Schocken was now a member, met in Wiles Hall in October. And it was Schocken's suggestion that the pavilion in the plaza, which had already been partially enclosed to become the town courthouse, be fitted up to house the city offices and a city jail. Sonoma City Hall has been located in the plaza ever since. And in December of that year, Schocken announced in a big ad the holiday goods and toys he had just acquired for sale. He had leased the land between his store and the Mission to Herman Locks, yet another native-born German since 1881, for $25 a month. Schocken was allowed to operate the bowling alley, but again, only when church services were not being held next door. And by 1884, Schocken let him build the Railway Saloon, an early entertainment center, because you had to enter the saloon in order to get to the bowling alley behind it. In the early 1880s, Schocken began a new business venture, the quarrying of basalt stone. The basalt block industry became a major segment of the economy of Sonoma. Millions of basalt paving stones would be sent to San Francisco, San Jose, Stockton, from Sonoma County. Paving the streets of San Francisco became essential as soon as cable cars first appeared in San Francisco. Variably sized cobblestones like these were no longer adequate. They had always been hard on horses because of the rounded surface. But more importantly for the cable cars, uniformly sized basalt blocks would stabilize the central slot for the cable, the rails, and the remainder of the surface of the street too. The west and south slopes of the Mayacamas Mountains north of Sonoma were considered one of the best areas of quality basalt deposits, and small quarries began in 1882. By 1884, the basalt stone from Sonoma County was beginning to be used extensively for paving the streets of San Francisco. And this required men to remove overburden, block makers, stone cutters, masons, loaders, haulers, teamsters, as well as boarding houses, mercantile stores, and saloon keepers. And Schocken entered into all phases of this business in the early 1880s. He leased a 62-acre parcel known as the Rock Quarry on Battery Hill for 3 years. His enterprise would continue to grow and come to dominate the basalt extraction industry in Sonoma, while providing him with considerable wealth. In 1886, Schocken's quarries produced 350,000 blocks and stimulated a boom in the economy of Sonoma, which regained a prosperous appearance. In 1888, Schocken purchased the quarry property. Battery Hill was soon referred to as Schocken Hill, which is the name we know it by today. And access was via 2nd Street East up this winding road. Prices for the blocks had increased 100% in 3 years. By 1889, Sonoma was providing 90% of all the blocks used in San Francisco. and he was sending 80,000 blocks, or 720 tons, per month. He hired Agostino Pinelli to manage the operations of the quarry. Pinelli and the Teamsters were paid by production, and soon Pinelli could afford property of his own to quarry. He remained a lifelong friend of Schocken. Schocken purchased another 7.5 acres on the east side of his quarry a few years later, so he could use the ravine on the east edge to build a second wagon road up to the quarry. He supplied his workers with the tools, the horses, and heavy-duty wagons to haul the blocks. Basalt boulders and ledges were detached with dynamite and crowbars. The stone was cut to size with chisels and hammers to a specified size of 3 to 4 inches wide, 8 to 12 inches long, and 7 to 8 inches deep. The dimensions of this basalt block falls within these parameters and teaches us that the typical block weighed 18 pounds. Now, the remaining chips from stone cutting were placed in hand cars and dumped into gullies where they remain today, as do the overgrown access paths. The blocks were loaded into heavy wagons and hauled by 4-horse teams into town. Samuel Sebastiani was one of these individuals hired by Schocken to bring the wagons to the train depot. Some people would try to steal the blocks from the piles of blocks, and the Sonoma Valley Constable Joe Ryan would hire guards to sit and watch the piles before they were loaded onto flat cars. Schocken employed close to 100 men in the quarries at this point. He gave them credit on his store ledger. Many recent immigrants from northern Italy came to Sonoma in the 1880s to work in the vineyards and quarries using the skills they had already acquired in Tuscany. Schocken was known to loan newly arrived families money and give them credit in his store. The Italians built the prosperous Garibaldi House as their hotel and cultural center on the east side of the plaza in 1880. It was Sonoma's first 3-story building. In 1889, Schocken happened to be drilling into the land behind his store, and he hit a very productive artesian well. Sonoma needed more water than could be provided from the old Vallejo waterworks installed in 1873. Schocken's artesian well was described as one of the largest in California, with a flow rate of 2,500 gallons per hour. It was so productive that he built a 30-foot diameter tank to hold 60,000 gallons behind his store. It was finished in 1889 and supplied water to all the properties nearby. He drilled a less productive artesian well behind the mission. In late 1890, Schocken announced his intention to build several handsome cottages on Spain Street east of the mission. He bought and sold many other properties in Sonoma and El Verano, but would keep the Spain Street cottages as rental property for the rest of his life. In 1892, he revealed plans for yet another new business venture. He wanted to build a rail line for freight and passengers from his quarries 6 miles to the head of navigation on the Sonoma Creek. It would be an electric railway, and a schooner service could then take his blocks to San Francisco at a much cheaper rate than any other basalt block contractor could. He hired a civil engineer to survey the rail line, and he was making ambitious plans to establish a resort behind the store with a swimming pool. It was to be covered with a huge glass roof, and he was just about to start the excavation when personal matters came to a head. Although Solomon and Dora had traveled back to Europe for several months in 1891, he now decided that he had had enough of his wife, and he filed for divorce on the grounds of her desertion and abandonment. Unusual grounds for a husband, but they had not actually lived together for over 10 years. He said that he had continued to support her financially while she lived in private rooms and hotels in San Francisco. He said she would rather die than live in Sonoma and insisted He had much wanted to have children, but she didn't. He said he had a miserable life in consequence of it. Dora did not answer the summons to appear in court and didn't contest the divorce that occurred in October 1893. But for the following 4 years, there was another economic depression. And once again, Schocken and Sonoma did very well financially. And part of the reason was that in order to stimulate their own economy, San Francisco had instituted major paving projects using basalt stone. Schocken soon became the only contractor for all the basalt blocks conveyed to San Francisco, with contracts now for 1 million blocks in 1893 and again in 1894. Business was booming in Sonoma. Schocken could now give employment to all who applied for work at $3 to $5 per day in the quarries. Hundreds of block makers, teamsters, and loaders were kept busy. Men brought their refreshments, they brought their pets, and some brought their sons to help in this dangerous work. And a short handle on this shovel would suggest that some of the children worked with their fathers in the quarry too. Schocken was often seen visiting the blasting sites to make sure there were no children too close for safety's sake. Hotel and boarding houses were crowded. The railway was very busy with up to 100 flat cars loaded with rock leaving each week for the new terminal at Tiburon, where the cars were put on ferries to San Francisco. In 1894, the railway could not keep up with the production of stone blocks, and Schocken added schooners, which left the embarcadero on the Sonoma Creek with blocks. Now, between 1895 and 1909, Schocken remained the principal local provider of paving blocks, although the demand and production was decreasing. Meanwhile, his store also remained a consistent source of income. He now had 4 nephews who were successful merchants in Northern California. But what really set him apart from his major competitors, Frederick During and Frederick Kluwe, was his much wider variety of products. He seemed to buy and sell almost everything. This included products no one else was selling in Sonoma, such as kerosene, coal oil, heavy-duty work clothes, and work boots. Now, on March the 8th, 1897, Solomon married Clara Handel at the residence of a rabbi in San Francisco. Clara had a daughter, Lily, from her previous marriage, and Lily was already married. Lily's husband visited the Yukon on news of the Klondike Gold Rush, and Schocken soon announced to friends he was considering a trip to and even opening a general store near Dawson City in the Yukon. Nothing came of these plans, partly because Lily's husband lost financially much more than he was willing to admit, returned to San Francisco, where he lived, and he committed suicide. Clara now returned to San Francisco to look after her widowed daughter and her infant grandson. Unfortunately, soon she too felt much more at home in San Francisco than Sonoma. But unlike Dora, Clara did make visits back to Solomon and Sonoma, often with friends over the next several years. However, to Solomon's growing disappointment, he would write many years later in his last will, she, quote, has in no way looked after my comfort and has had no interest in me whatsoever. She was my wife in name only. And it appears Solomon Schocken became more active in the Jewish faith around this time. We know he observed Yom Kippur. He became a patron of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum and Home Society for orphan and aged Jews without adequate means of support. During this time, Schocken's artesian well now supplied most of Sonoma, including the nearby Sonoma Brewery and Ice Plant. He organized the private artesian well owners of Sonoma into the Sonoma City Water Company. His well was producing 115 gallons per minute, and apparently remains to this day an auxiliary water supply for the city of Sonoma. Schocken established his own well drilling company, not only to drill, but supply pipes and build water tanks and build towers. It was Schocken's company that dug wells for Captain Boyes in 1899 and 1900, making possible the Boyes Hot Springs Resort. He dug wells for Rudolph Spreckels Ranch in the valley, for John Lunabos's Bellevue Hotel in El Verano, for Agostino Pinelli's creamery operation, and for many others, often drilling down 200 feet or more. In 1897, Schocken formed with other businessmen an electric light company, which would soon build a plant and string up wires. The company was incorporated in 1898, and by September, much of Sonoma had electric light. That same year, he sold the strip of land between his store and the Mission Chapel back to the city so they could now reopen the street and allow better access to the relocated depot of the San Francisco and Northern Pacific Railway. He lined the new streets with walnut trees and tore down the intervening buildings, except for the saloon, which was reconstructed in front of the Mission Chapel. The saloon restaurant was now called the Louvre. In the early 1900s, many Californians showed an interest in preserving historic landmarks. And among these groups was the Sonoma Valley Women's Club, founded in 1901. For 15 years, until they built their own building, Schocken would let them use the large parlor in his residence, which they dubbed their attractive club parlor, for $5 a month. They would use it for their meetings, their social gatherings, and their card games. For the occasional luncheon, he let them use one of his storerooms below. Now, the California Landmarks League, which was organized in 1902, had one of its goals the preservation of old missions. They headed a campaign to raise money and received the assistance from the Women's Club and from the native sons and native daughters of the Golden West. Randolph Hearst contributed $500 and let the league advertise in his newspapers. The league approached Schocken to see if he was willing to sell. They offered him $5,000 for the half acre, and he accepted. Hearst's paper reported that Schocken had taken good care of the property and successfully protected it from the attacks of relic hunters and other vandals. When portions of the roof of the priest quarters showed signs of collapse, he had taken down and carefully stored over 600 tiles, which he then turned over to the Landmarks League. He even installed what may be Sonoma's earliest attempt at historic preservation around 1890. He removed the Louvre that was on the property. The League didn't have enough money to restore the mission, and in 1904 urged the state legislature to assume responsibility. It was the heavy rains of 1909 and 1910, not the earthquake, that caused severe damage, but Schocken's small reinforcement held up. The legislature would finally restore the church and a portion of the priest quarters and open them to the public in 1914. On the commercial front at this time, it was clear to Schocken that there was a growing demand for crushed rocks. Schocken planned to supplement his basalt block production with aggregate produced from a rock crusher he would use on the tailings from over 20 continuous years of quarrying. The aggregate could be used in the production of asphalt. But Schocken also still wanted to build a summer resort, and now he chose the hill near the spring. He planned on this hill. He planned to build an electric railway from the resort and quarry to the mouth of the Sonoma Creek. In 1904, Schocken and a new business partner, Oscar Weber, applied to the County Board of Supervisors for a franchise to operate the electric railway. Passenger cars would reach Santa Rosa, Healdsburg, and Calistoga. He would have another branch to the mouth of the Russian River, and another county franchise was requested to extend the system beyond the summer resorts in the springs, where over 15,000 tourists visit a year, and up to the valley to Kenwood and the city limits of Santa Rosa. Yet another franchise was requested from the city of Sonoma for a route down Broadway and along West Napa Street to the city limits at 5th Street West. Although the existing railway consistently opposed any competing electric railway, Schocken managed to obtain all the franchises. He incorporated the Sonoma Valley Interurban Company in 1905 for a 50-year lifespan. It absorbed the Sonoma Valley Electric Light Company it founded. Poles and wires were being strung up already on the south side of the plaza, and he was about to order a rock crusher. Then the 1906 earthquake struck. Although Sonoma was not heavily damaged, Schocken's store was described as a wreck on the inside. In spite of the damage, Schocken kept his store open and loaned cash to local citizens. But the most damage to Schocken's enterprises from the earthquake was the fact that now he could not get the capital he needed for his electric railway projects because it was being diverted elsewhere. Italian immigrants continued to arrive to work in the Schocken's quarry even after the earthquake. Among these were the Viviani brothers, first Ulderigo, then Celso, and then Noni. But on October the 6th, 1909, Schocken decided to sell his entire 69.5-acre quarry property to the giant mining and ledging company, Natomas Consolidated. Although the offered cash price was just $10, Schocken became wealthy because he was now a substantial bondholder in the company too. And the reason he sold out in large part was because of this specific piece of equipment. If it looks vaguely familiar, it is because you've probably seen it hundreds of times without realizing its significance. It is the rock crusher you see directly across the highway from the cherry tree on your way to Sears Point. This particular piece of equipment was purchased by A.W. Foster to make aggregate at his own new quarry that operated until very recently. Schocken knew he could not compete with a crushing plant right on the railway line and only 1 mile from the Wingo terminal. Then, after an unexplained illness requiring surgery the next spring, in 1910, Schocken announced at age of 68 he was retiring from active business after 37 years in Sonoma on the advice of his doctor. The Sonoma Index Tribune wrote, "Upright and square in all his business dealings, Mr. Schocken has made a host of friends in this valley who remember him always as the fairest merchant Sonoma ever had. Although he bought real estate in San Francisco, he continued to live mostly in Sonoma at this time." The store was rented out over the following years to a number of merchants, including some of his nephews. In June of 1921, A.L. Minotti leased Schocken's store to sell groceries. He operated this store until 1928. Schocken continued to sell water from his artesian wells to Sonoma and continued to collect rent from his numerous rental properties in Sonoma and San Francisco. He had earlier said, "Any damn fool can make a buck, but not everyone can save one." He had been one of Sonoma's 3 wealthiest residents, along with Frederick Doring and David Burris, who founded the Sonoma Valley Bank. Schocken was a stockholder in the bank. Now Doring and Burris were dead, and in 1923, his good friend Agostino Pinelli died a wealthy man. Samuel Sebastiani had likewise used his earnings from Schocken to establish his own business empire founded on the same principles of providing the common resident a livelihood and producing desirable products that the worker could afford. And Celso Viviani, with Tom Vella, would go on to build a successful cheese manufacturing business on these same principles. Schocken continued to visit Sonoma almost every weekend and make small donations to various charities throughout the 1920s. But as the 1930s approached, these weekend trips to Sonoma were becoming a little too much for him. He did attend the 40th anniversary memorial of the death of General Vallejo and a 50th anniversary of his initiation into the Masonic Lodge. He was 88 now and considered auctioning off the old barracks building. He was told at this time by the Native Sons of the Golden West and other groups too that there was local interest in saving the barracks because of its historical significance, and he agreed to hold on to it a little longer. Perhaps his last visit to Sonoma was on Decoration Day, what we call Memorial Day today, in 1931 for a picnic and reunion of old families and pioneers at Bates Grove. He died 1 year later at the age of 89 from pneumonia in his San Francisco home at 1580 Jackson Street. He was buried in Colma next to his first wife, Dora, and a nephew. Solomon Schocken had been a fixture in Sonoma for so long that his death still came as a surprise to those who knew him. He was one of Sonoma's most respected citizens. He was remembered for his slow shuffling walk down the streets of Sonoma, for his love of hiking and the hills. He was remembered for his quiet, friendly manner without showing any social airs. He was always well dressed and clean. One resident said Schocken was just plain old Schocken. He never talked of his past or his religion. He was remembered for his innate business abilities, his kindness, and his aid when they were in need, even personally delivering groceries and adding some extra treat to the bag when they were too sick to work in his quarries. In 1980, August Pinelli, the son of Agostino, remembered him as being a brilliant and friendly man. Angelina Grasso, daughter of one of his stonecutters, said no one ever complained about working for him or his store, and he got along very well with all the Italians. She remembered he would often scoop out candy from the jar he had on the counter and drop it into the hands of kids who came by his store. Two of his nephews, Bernard and Albert Bayer, were the executors of Schocken's will and sold the remaining Sonoma properties over the next 6 years. William Murphy, publisher of the Sonoma Index Tribune, and his wife Celeste purchased the old barracks, site of Schocken's store and residence, on October the 26th, 1934, with all its remaining personal property. The same day, the most eastern Schocken cottage on Spain Street was sold to Annabali and Rosie Ricci. In 1935, the remaining 2 cottages were sold to Emilio and Zaira Tomasi. These cottages remained in the Tomasi family until just last year. Meanwhile, the Murphys had begun renovating the barracks, taking down the wooden facade, but keeping the bay window under the cupola. They moved into Schocken's old upstairs residence and subdivided the entire floor below into offices that they rented out. They sold the barracks in 1958 to the state, retaining life tenancy until 1962. The state conducted a major reconstruction between 1978 and 1980 to reinforce the walls and restore its appearance to a close approximation of that auspicious day in 1873 when a young Solomon Schocken rode into a very different Sonoma, which he would profoundly influence in a positive manner. Well, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions on this specific topic, you can contact me. And for general questions, please contact the Sonoma Valley Historical Society. Thank you.